Ableton Live, Logic, FL Studio, Pro Tools, Reason. We're going to go through a whole bunch of DAWs in today's video, basically all of the relevant DAWs, and I'm going to rank them and tell you which ones I recommend, the pros and cons. So let's get into it. First up, Ableton Live, Max MSP integration. Boom, amazing. Excellent MIDI support and some great stock plugins. So Ableton Live gets a thumbs up for me. So although Ableton Live can be fantastic for creating electronic music, you can't really push it much further than that. Often people bounce their music out of stems and mix it somewhere else. You're definitely not going to be doing any mastering in Ableton Live. It's just not the program of choice for that. But for production, it's pretty good. So I'm going to give it an A rating. Next up, FL Studio. It's come a long way since I started using it on version 3. Back then, you didn't even have audio tracks or a proper mixer or anything. Now you've got a lot of comprehensive tools, so it's come a long way from just a basic beat making kind of fun thing. It's really evolved into a bit more of a fully fledged DAW. But saying that, it's still a bit limited. No one's really going to be doing any serious professional mixing and mastering in FL Studio. You're not going to be doing that kind of stuff. You're normally going to be bouncing it out of Fruity Loops and putting it into something more serious to mix it down. And especially for mastering, I don't know any professional mastering engineers using Fruity Loops as their DAW of choice. And saying that, the full version to get all the plugins and stuff is actually a bit on the expensive side. So I think FL Studio's pretty good, especially if you're into making electronic music. A lot of hip hop guys use it, a lot of electronic music people who are loop based, sample based stuff. It's a really good choice. I'm going to give it a B. Next up, the native Apple DAW, Logic. But some people might not know that Logic wasn't actually made by Apple, it was actually made by iMagic. And I was using Logic 5.5 when it was still run by iMagic. And it was an absolutely serious choice of a DAW back in the day. Such a solid MIDI sequencer and pristine audio quality. A lot of people who were using other tools to compose with, like Fruity Loops or Reason or something like this, they would bounce it out of that or use Rewire to go into Logic and get a serious mixdown using Logic. So it has always been a very serious sequencer, and Apple have maintained a high quality standard. That said, I think there's some major drawbacks to using Apple Logic in my personal opinion. Now, I used to be a Logic user back in the day, but I long since ditched it and moved to another DAW that I'm going to be talking about later in the list. Now, in my personal opinion, the way that Apple makes software is they want to remove all of the sharp edges, make it look beautiful, make it intuitive, so that the most amount of users are going to get on with it and have fun using their software. And that is great, and I think that's a really good business mentality to have, and their design is exceptional. However, for the more advanced users, I feel like there's not a lot of advanced features and things that really are necessary for the power users, the advanced users. Now, this is sort of similar to some other pro level software in their lineup. So Final Cut Pro, for example, they used to have a really decent ripple edit based linear timeline. And then they scrapped that in favor of a storyline thing, which is just, in my opinion, oversimplified and terrible if you want to do anything more advanced than just, I don't know, some simple video editing. So they've really dumbed down Final Cut Pro, and so I ditched that and moved to DaVinci Resolve. So that's my main gripe with it. If you use it and get on with it, then I think that it's a really cool DAW anyway. The problem is just about how it's not really there for the more advanced user. But otherwise, it's a perfectly fine DAW, and I've given it a B rating. Pro Tools. It used to be the industry standard workhorse software in all recording studios that was serious. Nowadays, I feel like the way that they've gone with Avid, with their corporate business model and their subscription-based stuff, and they've only got AAX plugins, you can't even load a VST plugin or an AU plugin in Pro Tools. As far as I'm aware, that's not because of any technical reasons. That's just some weird corporate Avid decision to exclude developers and gatekeep their own personal plugin format, along with PACE, anti-piracy, and do this weird gatekeepery corporate stuff, which I just don't really like at all. The whole thing seems like bloated and slow and excessively big to install. I just don't really get it nowadays. It used to be good back in the day, but times have changed and there's much more advanced, better DAWs available for less money that just work better, that less bloated, less corporate, weird, greedy, gate-kept vibes. I don't know, I just don't really like it that much. If you were starting from scratch, I just don't see why you would choose Pro Tools as your DAW. I'm going to give it a C. Cubase. Back in the 90s, either you were a Cubase user or a Logic user. There were some other things that you could use on the market, but they were the two major market leaders. And it's always had a good reputation. A lot of people have used it. I used it for a couple of years back in the day, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's very mature technology. The audio is pristine. You can get very high quality results in it. And I know people who use it even for mastering, professional mixing. You can do everything in it. It's a very high quality, mature piece of software. However, it's sort of ugly in my personal opinion. It's sort of expensive in my personal opinion. And it's not that exciting. It just doesn't excite me. It is very sensible, and if you use it, I think it's a great piece of software. But I don't know. It's a bit expensive and a bit ugly for my personal taste. But I'm going to give it a B rating. Reason. So I started on Propellerhead Reason version 1 back in the day, and you could turn it round and patch in the patch cables, and that was absolutely amazing. And it looked absolutely sick back in the day. The graphics were amazing compared to a lot of the other competition at the time. It just looked phenomenal. It was like, wow, this is like something out of the future. How is this even possible that you can patch in these cables and it all looked 3D, and it was so cool. And of course it was a bit limited back then. You didn't really have audio tracks or anything. If you wanted to have any audio in there, you'd have to chuck it into the redrum thing and then trigger it on the redrum and do all sorts of tricks to get around that, so you could put some recording in there. Maybe you wanted a vocal in your track or something, then you have to do it like that. A lot of people back then, they were using Logic in tandem with Reason, using Rewire to pipe the audio into Logic, and then you could sync it up, and then you could add your vocals or whatever audio tracks in Logic. So that was also another approach that you could use back in the day. But since then, it's got a lot better, a lot more comprehensive, and now you can actually work with audio in Reason. So it's absolutely phenomenal now how it's improved. However, it's similar in kind to Fruity Loops, right? FL Studio, Fruity Loops, back in the day it was a similar kind of thing. It's a beat making tool. It's really cool for making electronic beats. But can you really push that into professional mixing and mastering? I would say not really. I'd say the type of people who are going to be using Reason are going to be bouncing out their stems or using Rewire to pipe that into another thing like Logic or something, and get a professional mix down in there and do mastering it in another DAW or send it off to be mastered. No one's really going to be using this DAW to do composition, mixing and mastering at a professional level, in my personal opinion. That said, I never got the vibe from Reason that it was trying to do absolutely everything and be a tool for professional mastering. So it's a bit NA in terms of that. So I'd still give it a solid B rating. Studio One. Now there's a lot of people who like this software. I think it looks just fine. There's a bunch of really cool stock plugins. It can do pretty much everything that you want a DAW to do. It looks just fine for composition, mixing, and there's even an integrated mastering page, which looks interesting. That said, I'm not entirely convinced by that mastering page. It looks cool, but it looks a bit too prosumer for me. It doesn't look something like a professional level tool that I could use for my job as a mastering engineer. If you use Studio One and get on with it, well, as I say, I think it looks just fine. It just doesn't excite me that much. I think it's very solid, and I would give it a B rating. Bitwig Studio, they used to be the new kid on the block, but now they've been out for a few years. They've got some really cool features. They've got full clap support because they're partly behind the clap formats, and they've got VST support and all the plugins that you want they've got, but they've even got some really cool stock plugins. And one of the craziest features that I've seen is that parameter modulation page that you can do. You can modulate anything from anywhere with LFOs and all sorts of stuff. It looks absolutely fantastic for composition. That said, where it's still relatively new compared to some of these other DAWs from the 90s, it's less mature, and there's some features that are still lacking, like advanced rendering capabilities. It's completely lacking from Bitwig, and I just couldn't use the software. There's also no scripting, no theme ability. There's a few things that are just not there yet, and so I don't think I could switch to it because the work that I do, I just couldn't do in Bitwig yet. But if they were to integrate some of these more advanced features, it would be something that I would consider switching to. That makes it quite difficult to rank, but I'm going to go for an A rating. Next up, Reaper. This is my DAW of choice, and this is what I use for my job on a daily basis as a professional mastering engineer. There's absolutely nothing that comes close to Reaper in terms of its capabilities. Now, a lot of people knock it because they don't think it looks as pretty as Logic or something else, or Bitwig. Maybe you like the look of some of these other software, and some people think that it's too difficult to get started with, the learning curve is too steep. But in my personal opinion, if you can get into it and you can understand how to use it, it is the most advanced DAW currently out there, and it just blows everything away. If something doesn't exist as a feature in Reaper, you can just literally just start programming. The scripting capabilities are ridiculous. You've got Lua script, you've got all sorts of JSFX scripts. You can write your own plugins in Reaper. You don't even need to use Xcode or something else and compile it as a VST plugin. You can literally just start writing code within Reaper. It's that crazy. And all of the advanced, it's just mind-boggling how many advanced features there are. I can't even get started with this. On every single plugin, you've got a wet dry knob, for example. Other DAWs don't seem to have that. Every single plugin, you've got a wet dry knob baked right into Reaper. And then you can also press one shortcut, and then you've got the delta. You can hear the delta. Just natively, on every single plugin, you can hear the delta of what it's doing. How cool is that? Other DAWs just don't seem to have that. Maybe some, but most of them don't have that. What else have I got written down here? It supports a whole bunch of different plugin formats: Clap, VST, AU, JSFX, and on Linux you've got all of the Linux plugins. Now the render matrix. The render matrix is absolutely game-changing for anything where you're bouncing out consecutive regions, stems, all sorts of different combinations of stuff. Like it saves so much time in my job as a mastering engineer using the render matrix. Now I know that in Cubase and some other stuff you do have some kind of similar features, and you've got like cycle things that you can place there and do sorts of work around stuff, but the render matrix in Reaper is just bang there, and it works, and it's just fantastic. It's just this grid thing that you can select exactly what you want to render, and this is an advanced feature which advanced users require on a daily basis for their jobs. And without this, you're just going to be sitting there twiddling your thumbs waiting for one thing to render, like in Logic, and then you have to do the time selection and render out something else. It's amateur stuff. This is professional level stuff, and it's right in Reaper. And then you've got the routing matrix, and you can route anything to anywhere with this crazy patch based stuff. It's just absolutely mind-boggling what you can do there. Now other DAWs have routing functionality as well, but stuff like Logic, for example, if you want to set up a sidechain thing, you need to like assign it to a bus, and then you've got like a fader over here, and then you've got to select the bus input on the sidechain, all weird stuff like this. In Reaper, you can just send anything anywhere. Now, I mentioned earlier that Bitwig has really cool parameter modulation stuff, but Reaper has had that for years. You can do LFOs, random walks, you can do all sorts of stuff. You can even get audio to trigger parameters in plugins. It's absolutely mind-boggling what you can do with that if you know how to use it. Yeah, it doesn't look as pretty as in Bitwig, it doesn't look as pretty as in some other stuff, but it's there, the functionality is there, and I use the functionality often, and it's advanced stuff which advanced users need, and it's all there in Reaper. Reaper is fast, it's solid, it's lightweight. When you download it, it's saying like 50 megabytes. When you download Ableton Live or Pro Tools or one of these other DAWs, it's like 5-10 gigabytes, and you've got no hard drive space left at the end of it. Now, some people want to say that Reaper doesn't look as pretty as some other DAWs. Well, maybe that's true to a certain extent, but you can write your own theme and just change it to be the exact way that you want it to be. And I did that myself, and now I'm very happy with the way that it looks for me personally. The big thing that I get annoyed by Reaper is the fact that there's so many updates, but they don't really seem to change anything ever. There's all of these trivial fringe updates about, we have fixed a bug that if you have some ridiculous MIDI thing that I would never use and connect it to this device that I've never heard of, then there was some glitch and we've fixed that. I don't care. Like, there's never been anything interesting that they've introduced for like actual years. I can't even remember the last time that I downloaded the latest version and was like, oh wow, there's something cool that's new and I like. They're all just trivial things that I don't care about. And when you look at something like Bitwig, and you look, oh wow, they've got this really nice page with this modulation stuff, that looks so cool. Why can't Reaper have something pretty and nice and integrated like that? It just seems a tiny bit old school, the way that it works. And so yeah, but you can't always have everything. You can have all of the features in Reaper because it's got everything that you want in terms of features, but it might not have all of the pretty fancy things that you might want from some other DAW. But Reaper, for me, it just has to get an S tier rating. There is nothing that comes close, in my opinion. Next up, Cakewalk. Now this is quite old software and it used to be a competitor to Logic and Cubase back in the 90s. However, it got bought by one company and then bought by another and passed around all over the place, and now it just seems a bit confused and it's Windows only. So on that ground alone, I would just say that it's failure. How can you make a Windows only software in this day and age? So failure, I'm just gonna give it a D rating. Just the mere fact that it's Windows only, and otherwise it just doesn't seem particularly exciting with so much competition in this market. Next up, Nuendo from Steinberg. Now the thing is, it's essentially Cubase plus a bunch of fancy post-production stuff that most people were never going to be using for music, and it's more expensive as a result. So we can just judge this in the same way that we judged Cubase, because it's essentially the same thing. And if you need those extra features, then they're there and you can pay for them. But I'm just going to give it a B and be done with that because it's essentially Cubase. Samplitude. Now this seems to be another DAW which has all of the normal features that you might expect from a DAW, but it's Windows only. D. Digital Performer. Don't get confused and think this is just some throwaway software which is bundled with Motu hardware. No, this is a serious DAW which is used a lot in film scoring and in the TV industry and industries where you need to do a lot of music with actual scoring, so musical notes, to video. So film stuff, writing to film or writing to TV stuff and stuff like that, where you need to do notes and video. It's incredibly powerful and set up exactly for that sort of workflow. So if that is your thing, then Digital Performer might be for you. However, the feature set that Digital Performer has isn't especially unique. Reaper can pretty much do everything that Digital Performer can do, for example, but Digital Performer is slightly better in terms of its scoring and video capabilities. So if that is your thing, if you do film scoring, for example, or TV sync work stuff to video, then maybe Digital Performer is the right tool for the job. But otherwise, it's just not especially unique. Unless you're a big fan of the chunk system, then it has no exciting features that aren't available in Reaper or elsewhere. So I'm going to give it a very strong C. Tracktion Waveform. Now their main offering is completely free, so I'm guessing they're thinking just because it's free, that's going to get people interested in it. I see a bit differently. I need to be interested in something because it's standing out in a crowded, saturated market with players like Cubase, Reaper, Ableton, Bitwig, Logic. We've got these absolutely phenomenal bits of software. And so if something is to attract my attention, it needs to do that on its merit, not merely by being free. Now, Tracktion Waveform doesn't seem to stand out in any particular way to me. Maybe it's a capable DAW, and that's fine. And if you want a free capable DAW, then I guess there's one available here. But there's other DAWs which are much better, and Reaper, for example, it's not free, you have to buy it, but it never really runs out the demo. So if you are a bit on a budget and you want to use the demo of Reaper for a while, I just recommend just grabbing Reaper. So I just don't really see why I'd be so lulled into getting something just because it's free. Now, so that on that reason, I'm going to give it a D rating. Ardour is another free DAW, but it's open source and part of the Linux community, which gives it more brownie points in my book personally. However, it's not entirely free if you want the pre-compiled binaries, unless you want to install it from the source code, which can be a bit more difficult on Mac and Windows. It's maybe a bit easier on Linux, but it's still easiest just to get the pre-compiled binaries like people are normally used to doing, or you actually have to pay for that. That said, it's a sort of pay what you want model, so you don't have to pay a lot of money. You could just pay a little bit of money and get the pre-compiled binaries there. But in a world where you've got other amazing DAWs which you can use even on Linux, so if you're a Linux user, you've got Reaper, you've got Bitwig, there's not really any reason why you would necessarily need to use Ardour, in my personal opinion, especially not for professional work. It doesn't seem to be as capable as some of the commercial offerings. So that seems to be the case with many bits of Linux software. It's often great and really cool for beginner or intermediate users, but the commercial offerings are necessary for more advanced or professional users in many cases, and it's no exception here. So I would recommend, even if you're on Linux, although Ardour's also available for Mac and Windows, I would not be that enticed in Ardour personally. I would give it a D rating. Harrison Mixbus. Now this piece of software is modeled to look like an analog mixing console, and everything in it looks kind of analog and cool. Now it's very pretty, and it's sort of capable as well as a DAW. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, but in my personal opinion, the emphasis is on a skeuomorphic approach, interface design, and making stuff look pretty and vintage and analog. And in my personal opinion, that's not really what I need as a professional audio engineer. I need functionality. I need features that are going to be time-saving, effective, fast, accurate, and stuff like this. I don't want to like twiddle vintage looking knobs and stuff like that. So it's sort of a bit of a gimmick. It does have Atmos support in there, but if you want the Atmos support, you got to buy the more expensive version. It's pretty, but maybe it's just a pretty face. Gonna give it a D rating. UAD Luna. Now this is going to work very tightly with the Apollo hardware, so all of the UAD stuff is going to come together very nicely and tightly in a UAD ecosystem. Now I guess it looks a tiny bit similar to the Harrison Mixbus approach of making skeuomorphic interfaces, vintage old looking stuff that you can twiddle knobs and have pretty looking interfaces and stuff like that. Again, I'm not really a fan of pretty looking interfaces for the sake of them being pretty. I'm more into functionality and precision and productivity, speed, accessibility, shortcuts, advanced features, proper rendering support, and all of those more professional level stuff that you find in Reaper, and this is built into into the fabric of Reaper. I'm not really sure if it's got that as its main focus. This seems to just be this novelty value, pretty interface twiddle knob type thing again, with expensive plugins and expensive hardware, when you can get the same kind of sound using free stuff or less expensive stuff. So for me, it doesn't really impress me that much. It's not really the kind of thing that I look for in a professional sequencer for serious work. This is something that is maybe for a beginner or an intermediate hobbyist to twiddle knobs and have some fun and look at some pretty vintage looking pictures. So in that respect, I would say I would give it a D rating. Now, let me know what you think of my ratings, if there's any DAWs you think that I've missed on this list, and the first people to tell me what these records are here can win a secret special prize.